I've been told I need to speak more into the microphone, so I hope everybody can hear me now. I'm not really sure this introduction is strictly necessary, as our speaker tonight is quite well known, and many of you got to meet him before we sat down for dinner tonight. But nonetheless, I will carry on with an abbreviated version of Mr. Forbes' biography. Steve Forbes is chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media. The company's flagship publication, Forbes, is the nation's leading business magazine with a circulation of more than 900,000. Forbes, combined with Forbes Asia, Forbes Europe, and the company's licensee editions together reach a worldwide audience of more than 5 million readers. Forbes.com has become one of the world's most influential websites with more than 80 million unique visitors a month. Forbes coverage includes keen insights on issues of interest to us at the Martin Center, including higher education, innovation, and the workforce. Mr. Forbes is an advisor at the Forbes School of Business and Technology with the University of Arizona Global Campus. In both 1996 and 2000, Mr. Forbes campaigned for the Republican nomination for the presidency. Key to his platform were flat tax, medical savings accounts, a new Social Security system for working Americans, parental choice for schools, term limits, and a strong national defense. In 1985, President Reagan named Mr. Forbes chairman of the Bipartisan Board for International Broadcasting. In this position, he oversaw the operations of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Mr. Forbes was reappointed to his post by President George H.W. Bush and served until 1993. Steve Forbes received his BA in history from Princeton in 1970, and he serves on the board of trustees of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, the board of overseers of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, the board of advisors for the School of Public Policy of Pepperdine University, and the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. He previously served on the boards of Princeton University, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and the Heritage Foundation. Please give a warm welcome for tonight's speaker, Steve Forbes.
Jenna, thank you very, very much, and thank all of you helping the Martin Center. I think this is a wonderful example of one of the great strengths of this country and why we shouldn't despair about the future. Almost 200 years ago, a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, visited this country and wrote a classic book called American Democracy, which is still read in places where they do reading, and another subject for another time. But one of the things that he marveled at was what he called voluntary associations, people coming together to do things. It could be professional, sports, fixing a bridge, making a hospital, people he thought were joiners, always doing something. And he said, what a contrast to medieval Europe, where you waited to be told what to do, or you asked permission if you could do something. He said, here, people just get together and do it. And he said, this is great training for citizens of a republic. And that kind of energy, I think, has been a hallmark of this country. And this is why this upcoming election is going to be, even though we may not be enamored with certain personalities, will be one of the most important in American history in the sense of where do we go from here? Are we going to become more like Europe that Tocqueville came out of? Or are we going to be the kind of country we were 200 years ago, full of energy, people going and doing things, entrepreneurship, whatever name you want to give to it? Are we going to be able to keep that characteristic? I think you're an example of why, yes, that characteristic will remain and will not be smothered. So in terms of looking out, I think that let me just get a couple of things out of the way before I get to the economy. One is, unfortunately, the war in the Middle East. And I'm going to be blunt since I've had my free dinner. And you may be losing yours, but I'm keeping mine. And what I say. So, what has happened with the attack today, and also one of the most extraordinary military operations in history, with what the Israelis did against Hezbollah, is doing against Hezbollah, is an example of what happens when the United States is not seen as a reliable backup power and leaving the world to itself. And the Israelis figured, we have to do this on our own. Shortly after October 7th, just about a year ago, the Israelis sent some aircraft to go after the leader of Hezbollah, which they finally did a year later. And halfway through the flight, the planes were called back because the administration said, no, you're not to do this. So the Israelis have concluded, as other countries are concluding, is that the U.S. is not a reliable power. And the blunt truth is, if we get things right, the rest of the world has a chance to get things right. If things go wrong here, that's bad for the rest of the world. Like it or not, we are really the power that makes the world a more liberal, in the traditional sense, place. And what has happened since World War II is miraculous. You look at Europe, whoever would have thought in 1945 that a war between Germany and France would be absolutely and utterly inconceivable. That's what NATO has provided. But if people cannot rely on the U.S., then you are going to not get the kind of good operations from Israel. But unfortunately, our adversaries truly believe that the U.S. is a declining power. And they've concluded that really since the crisis of 2008, especially in Beijing. And when people think you're a declining power, miscalculations can be made, which can have consequences that no one fathomed or could have imagined. So the sooner we get our act together, the better. And in terms of what's happening around the world, Israel took matters in its own hands. I do think there's going to be future conflict because they're not going to let Iran get the bomb. I think that's clear, one way or the other. So you're going to have real conflict in the Middle East. Ukraine, and this is controversial, but Ukraine is, like it or not, now essential for the defense of Europe. If Putin wins there, he will start putting pressure on other countries. It's not like 1939 where they go marching across the border. He did that against the Ukraine. But there are other forms of pressure to bend you to their political and economic will. And that was already underway before the invasion of Ukraine. Missed opportunity. I hope we don't miss the opportunity with Israel, what they're doing in the Middle East and trying to create a new paradigm there. But we did miss an opportunity 2 years ago with Ukraine when they initially hit the Russians hard. But since then, we've never given them the weaponry they need to push the Russians out or at least take back a large part of their territory. We've been laggard on giving them what they need, and every upgrade of weaponry, every barrier removed has come from pressure from, amazingly, the Europeans. The move that the Ukrainians are doing in Russia, hitting bases there, which we barred them from doing, that came from intense pressure from the British, not from us. We initially opposed it. So this, again, has people wondering, are we a reliable guarantor against the bad guys? And I don't have to mention the South China Sea and China's relentless pressure there. Just like the Houthis have closed off the Red Sea, China won't close off the South China Sea because it depends on the trade there. About 30% of global trade goes to those waterways, but they want to control them. And one of the bedrocks of American foreign policy has always been freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas. And now we've blown that in the Red Sea, and we must not lose that in the South China Sea, not to mention the East China Sea, but can see it play out now in the pressure they're putting on the Philippines, fishing in waters that the Chinese say, you want to fish in these waters, they may be international in the eyes of some, but you got to kowtow to us if you want to do it. So they're ramming Filipino fishing vessels and the like. They're getting uglier and uglier confrontations there. So in terms of looking ahead, the longer we take to get it together, the more dangerous it is. Let me just close on Ukraine and the war there. The casualties there, nobody knows the exact number, but intelligence estimates that the casualties there are almost 1 million on both sides, mostly Russian, but both sides. To put that in perspective, in World War II, our total casualties were 1.1 million. That war alone will soon match what we lost in a world war. And that's what happens when you abdicate and not use power carefully, but forcefully in a way in which adversaries know there's certain lines you don't cross. So in terms of the big rebuild, in terms of procurement, we need reform there. I was telling at the table, I ran into Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State, at a green room the other day, and he graduated from West Point, first in his class, and we were talking about procurement at the Defense Department, which is talking about Eram's law. That's Moore spelled backwards, Moore's law spelled backwards. And Eram's law is every new weapon system takes longer and longer to develop and bring to fruition, always 2, 3, 4 times above budget. And I asked him, what do you do about the procurement system? And he says, you blow it up and start all over again. So if a certain candidate wins, I hope that man is in charge of the Pentagon. But in terms of looking out, the other thing, before I get to the economy, of course, is the minor thing of the elections. So let me get to it. The election itself, as I mentioned, even though the candidates are not Lincoln Douglas debates or even Kennedy Nixon debates, I'll just stop there. But the issues involved are very, very real. So in terms of President Biden, unfortunately, he's continuing to deteriorate, and even though it's a remote possibility, the possibility he may have to resign before January 20th cannot be entirely ruled out. And what that impact would have if it came before the election or after the election is unfathomable today. We live in a time where unfathomable things are happening. On the races themselves, the Republicans, I think, will take the Senate. The Democrats have a shot at the House of Representatives. And in terms of the presidential race, don't pay attention to the polls, because it boils down to 7 states, as you know. Your state, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. You've got Wisconsin, Michigan. They're very, very important states, swing states, and the big one, Pennsylvania. That's where it'll be decided in the Electoral College. Today, and again, this is just a prediction, today, I think the male candidate would win in spite of himself, but I'm not betting a penny on it because things do change. And it's a good thing he went after Taylor Swift. If he had gone against Elvis Presley, my hero from childhood, I might have had some real issues here. So let me get to the economy. Let's start with the big one, inflation. First of all, how the Fed says they want 2% inflation, which begs the question, how do you measure it? There are all sorts of indexes out there, and they're all wrong. The CPI, for example, the mother index, consumer price index, leaves out as a cost of living the interest you pay on a mortgage, the interest you pay on, say, a car loan, or the interest you might pay on a credit card. Now think of that for a moment. Those are real costs of living. But why are they left out of the consumer price index? Once upon a time, they were part of the CPI. Then in the early 1980s, they were taken out. Why? Well, at the time, Social Security was in financial trouble. And so, even though they'll vigorously deny it, they took out, for specious reasons, interest as a cost of living. because that meant that the rate of inflation on which you adjust future Social Security benefits would be less than before. So a little sordid, but so in terms of real inflation, Larry Summers, who served as Secretary of Treasury under Bill Clinton, calculated with a couple of other economists that the height of inflation in this country was not the number we get a couple of years ago, 9.2%. The actual number was 18. And the number today is not 2 to 3%, it's more like 5 to 6%. So this 2% goal of the Federal Reserve is really, in the real world, non-operative. And this gets to part of the problem of the Fed. Inflation has been around since human beings have been around. They can trace it back 3,000 or 4,000 years. You think after 4,000 years, central bankers might learn something about the subject. But unfortunately, the Federal Reserve on inflation believes that inflation is caused by prosperity, people buying too many things. And that's why when they see inflation emerging, prices going up, they say we have to slow the economy down. What they're doing is deliberate. They hope they don't hurt too many people, but they want more people out of work. They don't want the economy growing very much, and maybe go into a mild recession, because that's what they think inflation's all about. The actual definition of inflation is lowering the value of your currency. Basic, lowering the value of your currency, you get inflation. And so price rises don't cause inflation, contrary to what you hear on the campaign trail. They are a symptom, a result of inflation, not the cause, the result of what happens when you knock down the value of your currency. This gets to really, to try to get your mind around it, there are really two kinds of inflation. And we wrote a book on it called Inflation, what it is, why it's bad, and how to fix it. But there's what you might call non-monetary inflation. That is, when you get a disruption from a war, we see what Ukraine is doing to food prices and the like, a natural disaster such as hit this part of the region, and our hearts go out for what's happening in the western part of your state, that has an impact temporarily on prices. When you shut the economy down during COVID, that has an impact on prices. Non-monetary inflation. The strike that we're getting hit with the ports will disrupt supply chains and send up prices. That's non-monetary. And manipulating interest rates is not going to cure it. The Fed can't do anything about that. The way you cure it is you let the economy heal. The classic example is World War II, where after the war ended, we had a period of time of adjustment. You don't overnight go from making tanks to making refrigerators, and price controls came off, and so for 3 years, the papers were full of stories about the rising cost of living as we adjusted from a wartime to a peacetime economy, taking off wartime controls and rationing. But the economy healed and we moved forward. So unfortunately, this round, we are mostly recovered from the COVID disruptions, but now we have a slew of regulations coming along, and we have things like the port strike coming along that can artificially raise prices in a very real way. So non-monetary inflation, just let the economy heal. In terms of monetary inflation, stabilize the value of the dollar. And the amazing thing is, there's absolutely no talk among any central bankers about currency stability. It's all about, is the economy too strong? And just if you want to impress people at a cocktail party, talk about the Phillips curve. It's not a baseball pitch. Economists say there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In essence, if you want lower inflation, you have to have higher unemployment. If you want lower unemployment, you have to accept higher inflation. Real-world experience shows it's nonsense, but at the Fed, it is holy writ, and among a lot of other central banks as well. So we get this crazy situation where, is the Fed going to ease too soon? Now, someday the economy is going to boom. And then you'll hear our central bankers talk about, is the economy overheating? Like it's a machine. And ask yourself, if you're earning more money, do you feel you're overheating? At night, do you start to sweat? Oh my God, my pay's going up. Can't live with this. Stop the overheating. But that's their mindset. So unfortunately, in the future, even though nominal numbers on price increases have come down, the Fed's model is still profoundly wrong. And I hope the next administration will start to pay real attention. One of the virtues of being a central banker is people can't understand the subject. Central bankers make sure they speak in a way in which their words are in English, but you can't quite, what are they saying? And the implication they want to leave is you're the dumbbell, not them obfuscating and confusing what is very plain. So in terms of inflation, they don't understand it, and that means more trouble in the future. So in terms of, and one other thing on the subject of inflation is, and we all accept it, is their control of interest rates. That is the equivalent of rent control. Now most, certainly in this group, know that rent control distorts the real estate market. What the Fed is doing is a financial version of rent control. You know, in olden times, they would even use the word renting the money. Calvin Coolidge said, oh, the foreigners rented the money. So the interest you pay is the rent you pay to borrow the money, rent the money. So everyone accepts that the Federal Reserve should go for rent control. And the fact of the matter is they have no idea of how to guide the economy through interest rates. They keep stabbing at it very clumsily, but they should be out of the rent control business. They can charge what they want for overnight lending. What they should do is leave the economy alone and only intervene at a time of crisis, a time of panic, and just leave it at that. So we've got a long ways to go. So the next time you hear about, oh, will the Fed cut too much and stimulate the economy too much, just say, oh my God, they have a lot to learn. So in terms of looking ahead, I think I take some comfort when Trump said the other day, I know where he got the words from, that the U.S. dollar should remain the world's reserve currency. In other words, used for global trade, i.e. a strong dollar. So I'm grabbing at anything. I'll take that at least he's ahead of the curve on that one. But we have to do it. We have to do it. So in terms of looking out for inflation, the costs are the wounds are self-inflicted, and they are very, very real in terms of cost. So in terms of another aspect of the economy, this is very dangerous, is what is called modern socialism. The Marxists of old thought socialism meant the government owning the means of production, the government owning things. After World War II, starting with the Brits, they nationalized everything, railroads, electricity, banks, nationalized everything. Modern socialists realize you don't have to go through the rigmarole of taking over companies. You do it through excessive regulation. You let the private sector run it, but make sure their existence depends on the whims of those in government. You see, look what they're doing to the energy industry. Look what they've done to the banking industry. The head of the J.P. Morgan the other day pointed out that at least twice a year they have to file, in terms of capital adequacy, a report running 180,000 pages. Does anyone read that stuff? No. But what it all does is make everyone understand your survival depends on the sufferance of regulations. And so banks now are under pressure, always it seems, to hire compliance officers instead of loan officers. I exaggerate, but not by too much. Because once upon a time, small banks, community banks, were the biggest source of startup capital for businesses in this country. Today, the paperwork you have to do for a loan, cover yourself, oh, that's risky. Lending is risky, hello? But with regulators, the less you do, the better. And one of the things the Fed has done is pay a nice rate of interest on bank reserves, a little under 4 or 5% now. So the bank just keeps their reserves and deposits the Fed. They earn a nice piece of change, not the way you encourage lending. So when they talk about the Fed cutting interest rates, I want to know, what are they cutting the interest they pay to banks to park their money at the Federal Reserve? That is the real interest rate. So in terms of modern socialism, again, they don't ban things, they just regulate them out of existence. For example, the internal combustion engine. What they do there is, they're going to make it, if these rules stay in place, like tailpipe emissions, they grab anything they can, they make it so expensive that you're not going to be able to buy the internal combustion engine car in 5 or 6 years. They just price it out of the market. And so, again, gas stoves, remember those? They don't ban them. The EPA regulations make 96% of current gas stoves illegal. That's how they do it. Washing machines, they still have them in kitchens, but once upon a time they could do a load of dishes in under an hour. The old ones could do that. But regulations, what, 2 times, 3 times, 3 hours, 4? It's ridiculous. So everything that makes modern life worth living, they want to regulate out of existence. So they're going after gas stoves, heaters, lawnmowers, refrigerators, leaf blowers, snow blowers, refrigerators, overhead fans, light bulbs, and in New York, pizzas made in wood-burning ovens because they have emissions. Somebody calculated that if you took all the emissions from pizza parlors in New York, it would take a pizza parlor 849 years to match the emissions of John Kerry's private plane. And so what we have here is that kind of control. And also now, some talk about cows have emissions. They want to, in effect, ban or restrict beef and lamb. And so Tocqueville talked about how all these, he didn't know about these, obviously, but these minor intrusions on your daily life really sap the energies of individuals and make them more subservient to the government. That's what, I'm being blunt, that's what that does. Now another issue, of course, is taxes. I'll be again blunt. If the tax proposals, and I don't think they'd pass, but if the tax proposals proposed in the Biden budget, endorsed by Vice President Harris, were ever enacted, we'd have a depression. Remember the character Scrooge McDuck, the Disney character in his money bin? You know, piles of money, gold, jewelry, and the like. That's what they think wealth is. Just sitting there, and you just go in there and pick up the cash and off you go. They don't realize that wealth, most of it is asset values. And if you have an environment where you're destroying capital, you can't create new things to make for a better future, values go down. You destroy wealth. And money bins aren't going to rescue you from that. And so they don't understand when you destroy capital, you're destroying the future of an economy. So, unrealized capital gains. Oh, only the rich will pay. Well, how would they pay under their proposal? They'd pay it. How would they pay it? They'd have to sell assets, hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Now, you know what that would do to stock prices. So it's not just the rich that are going to pay. Everyone's 401k, IRA, pension plan, whatever, is going to take a hit from that kind of forced sales to pay that kind of tax. Same thing with wealth tax. The proposal on corporate, the business tax would make ours one of the highest in the world, the second highest, higher than China. Boy, that's smart right now. Personal income tax rates go up. Capital gains tax rates would be at the highest since the 1970s. None of you are old enough to remember the 1970s, but it was a rotten decade economically. And that's when we had a high capital gains tax. So taxes are a burden. Taxes are a price. The tax you pay on work, tax you pay for taking risks, the tax you pay to work out, tax you pay on profit. If you raise the price, you get less of the good things like productive success, productivity, new products, new services. It goes poof. That's why I love the flat tax. The flat tax would take the current code. I used to say bury it, but the EPA probably wouldn't approve. It's so toxic. But it's over 10 million words and rising. And nobody knows what's in it. We spend $300 billion a year at least complying with the code. IRS tells us we spend 6 billion hours a year filling out tax forms. So go back 20 years. Over 100 billion hours, literally trillions of dollars to comply with a corrupt thing that nobody understands. Even the IRS really doesn't know what's in it. Now imagine if those trillions of dollars had gone for new products, new services, new medical devices, new medicines. How better off we'd be, the opportunity cost of this thing. So right now nobody is proposing it. I don't understand why. It polls very well. But eventually, I think we will throw the thing out, like do what Mike Pompeo wants to do to procurement at the Defense Department. We'll do it to the tax code, bury it, simple rate. Family of 4, no federal income tax on your first $54,000 of salary, no tax on savings, and no death taxes. You'd leave the world unmolested by the IRS. And the energy that alone would release would be profoundly positive. And when tax day comes around, you could literally do it with a few keystrokes. That's good news for household pets, that they're not going to be around if you get too frustrated with this thing. And so it's good all around. So when you look out at this world today, and healthcare, let me just say something quick on healthcare. We have some splendid healthcare in this country. I and my family have been beneficiaries of some extraordinary procedures that have been developed over the years. But if government controls healthcare, innovation goes by the boards. Europe was once a great producer of new medicines and devices. But as government in the 60s and 70s became more predominant, you could see the graph down. We still get some good stuff, like Switzerland, which doesn't have the kind of intrusive system other countries have. Germany's not too bad. But you can see creativity, innovation goes out the window. And I'm at an age where this is why I like AI. I don't want to have to wait 12 years to prove a drug. I want it in 12 days. And I think a lot of you, as you get older, too. I shouldn't emphasize the age thing too much, except to say, Mark Twain, just as an aside, Mark Twain once said, inside every old person is a young person crying out, how did this happen? So in terms of healthcare, one of the things that's happened in healthcare is that companies now, most of them have high deductible plans. People are now paying out of pocket more than they ever have before. So they're going to want to know, what is this costing? That means transparency in pricing. You go and you say in advance what you want. What is this going to cost? You get a blank stare still a lot of the time. But people want transparency. And because more money is going to be coming out of their pocket to pay for it, you're going to start to see a revolution in terms of a consumer health care economy, which would be a profound change, positive change, taking a system that is careening towards just unsustainability to one that becomes a huge generator of capital and good and better health. We see little pockets of it. Want to fix your eyes? You want cosmetic surgery? Cosmetic surgery, none of you need it, but it's very popular, and it's called pandering. Tried it in politics, didn't work, which is why I'm here tonight instead of my presidential library. But in terms of cosmetic surgery, it's not covered by insurance usually, unless it's a result of disease or accident. So as a result, you have not had the kind of price inflation there that you've had in the rest of medicine. And LASIK surgery, same thing. Price of LASIK surgery today is much lower, both in nominal and real terms, than it was 20 years ago. Better results. Why? Because providers know they want to get you to use them, so they want to come up with better and better results. and they want to make it more and more affordable. We're going to start to get that in healthcare, and it's going to be a profoundly positive thing. As for the budget and the spending, if we just remove a lot of what I call crony green spending, you're going to save literally hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. And when you have 8.5 billion people on the earth, you're going to have impacts on the environment. So that's not the issue. The issue is what you do about it. And unfortunately, I'm being blunt here again, unfortunately, the way we've approached it in terms of trying to develop new sources of energy has been extraordinarily inefficient and wasteful. $7 trillion in the last 23 years spent on renewables, and the amount of world energy coming from coal, gas, oil, and the like is about 82%. 20 years ago it was 86%. So we've spent $7 trillion for 3 or 4%, and countries that went whole hog in it, like Germany and Britain, electricity costs doubled and tripled, and for very little result. And when you look at the whole process of developing those devices, you find out the environmental benefit is almost zero. Let me just close with one statistic. You take a wind farm, take a wind farm, typical wind farm, that can provide juice for 75,000 customers. A gas-fired facility, you could do that with a facility the size of a house, typical house. To do it with a wind farm, you need 10 square miles, 20 windmills, each taller than the Washington Monument, and a typical windmill in these wind farms. Each one requires a hole 30 feet deep, 2,500 tons of concrete, and you also need lubricants for these machines. They just don't go on their own. And then when they become obsolete, as they do, how do you reclaim land with 2,500 ton blocks of concrete 30 feet deep in the earth? So it's not that we don't have problems, it's just we've approached it in an extraordinarily political, wasteful way. So let's get smart. Two things that are obvious, there are others coming along. There's obviously nuclear power, which can do it. The trouble there is we've stifled development for years. I was talking at lunch today. If you took the normal development of nuclear power, you've heard of the learning curve, where when you do something each day, you see this, or we can do this better. Whenever you do a project, you're always making little adjustments. You learn as you go, make it better and better. That was stifled in the nuclear power industry after the 3 Mile Island, which, by the way, has now been taken over by our friends at Microsoft. They're going to recommission this closed power plant. But if you had the normal learning curve, nuclear power today, instead of being stifled, would cost 10% of what it does now. And then there's natural gas, a clean fuel. Now, there are other things in development. I mentioned nuclear power. One is called molten salt nuclear technology. In closing, that was back in the 1950s. The Air Force experimented with nuclear-powered airplanes. After all, we had nuclear-powered submarines, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Why not aircraft? So you don't have to worry about refueling in the air. Well, the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles put that aside, but now that technology is being dusted off, that research is being dusted off. Very different, very safe from traditional nuclear power sources. So there's a lot of ferment there. So again, it's not that we don't have problems, there are better ways to do it. So a lot of what I've told you is somewhat grim, but there are good signs out there. One is education. Education savings accounts are growing, so we're getting reform there. States like yours cutting taxes, showing red states versus blue states, and the results there, real live laboratories in the federal system. I think you're going to get real procurement reform. And in terms of health care, you are going to get a consumer market. If you want to see how it would work, just look at Singapore. Singapore has excellent health care. Their longevity now exceeds that of the U.S., and their system costs about 30% of ours, even though the doctors come from schools, medical schools all around the world. How do they do it? They have taxes, but the money goes into your own account, which you control. You choose which hospital you go to. You choose what health care plan you want. And so you have advertisements on TV. Use our plan, it's better. Use our hospital, it's better. So you have a real competition. And that's what I think is going to happen to Medicaid. We're going to go, each state's going to go to a version of the Singapore route and turn a huge drain where the results are not very good to where patients are in charge. I think you're going to get a much more responsive system. So a lot to be pessimistic about, but a lot of interesting things are happening out there. And the nice thing about a free people is we can make it happen. Thank you. So do we have time for a couple of questions, or are we?
We can take a few questions, yeah.
Take a couple of questions. You deserve it after what you've been through.
Ms. Forbes, thank you again for taking time to be here. What an honor it is for you to come speak with me. This question relates to artificial intelligence and large language models. Specifically, it relates to media and content creation, impacting Forbes. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that's impacting the industry, as well as your thoughts on the greatest societal benefit and greatest risk that that technology will have.
Well, AI is one of those things that it depends on how it is used. And I hope that the rules that we make are based on real-world experience and not just fears. One of the problems is a dreadful words, artificial intelligence. Think of it. We don't call airplanes artificial birds. We don't call cars artificial horses. And so the fears are there. By the way, a little over 200 years ago, when electricity started to really bloom, there were fears that electricity could be used in nefarious ways to create new forms of life. And that's how we got the novel Frankenstein, written in fear that electricity could make these monsters, bring monsters to life in a laboratory. Great fun for novels and movies, but the fears, as we now see, were overblown. Electricity, we know, can be disastrous, but we couldn't live without it. We learn that, sadly, when we get a disaster like what's just happened. So in terms of AI, it's been hyped, and there'll be a lot of fallout. Numerous companies are coming into it. That's how it happens. Most of them will go by the boards, but others are going to hit, the way you saw when the internet was developed back in the late 70s, early 80s. And we learn how to use it more and more. Already in hospitals, they're doing experiments now where they're using AI to determine, before it shows up, infections, staph infections, by putting in data, connects things in a way where before the symptom shows, they can go and attack a potential killing infection. And so, and it's in some hospitals, 70-80% reduction in infections. So these things do have a good side, but like anything else, it can go very, very wrong. And that's where we have to be mature as a people. Make sure we put not just rules, but customs and things you do and don't do in societal prohibitions, which seem to be getting blasted away these days, where things you just don't do it. It's not that it may be against the law, but it's just something you don't do. Custom guardrails, social guardrails. So it's a good thing. It, for example, shows real promise of sharply reducing. I made reference to developing new medicines, new medical devices, sharply reducing the time it takes to determine whether this thing is efficacious. We've all heard, and eventually it's going to happen really more wide scale, is you'll be able to get bespoke medicine. A drug that may work for you may be a disaster for me. And you'll be able to determine that, what works, instead of the situation we have now where if a certain percentage of people have an adverse impact, they kibosh the drug, instead of figuring out who does it work for and where the result's going to be bad. So again, it may sound Pollyannish, but the time is going to come where replacing a heart, replacing a kidney will be as routine as placing a tire on a car. And still a long ways to go on that, a lot of challenges, but it's going to happen. And that's why you want the environment that Tocqueville saw, an environment where that kind of experimentation. This gets to, and I've abused your time, but this gets to what Tom Sowell, the great economist who should have won the Nobel Prize, someday they will, but he doesn't get it now because of politics. But anyway, Sowell said, ask yourself, what is the difference between us today and people in the Stone Age? Same human body, same planet, same resources, same appetites. The difference between them and us is we know more. We have more knowledge. And that's why I want an environment where you create more knowledge. George Golder calls it surprises, things that people hadn't thought of before. And I was just telling at the table of a series that I'm working on called Achievement, where we have 3-minute videos, biographies of people who have created the modern world, but doing it in 3-minute videos, promoting free markets. But free markets is abstract. The best way to get these points across is through stories of real-life people doing real things. And I'll just close with one example which shows food health. People will not like it, but I don't think they'll be too upset. But anyway, back in the 1930s, a woman named Margaret Rudkin had a kid. One of them had very real health problems, and one of his problems was he couldn't eat processed bread. And the doc said, well, maybe, you got to, too bad there's not some breads with wheat that he might be able to eat and not get sick. So long story short, she experimented using different ingredients, grinding the wheat with a coffee grinder to develop a bread. She invented modern whole wheat bread. And it worked for her son. The doctor was impressed. He recommended it to other physicians. And so she found herself in the bread business, and she decided to name it after where she lived, Pepperidge Farm. And then she went to Europe, found a chocolatier in Belgium she really liked, the way they did chocolate. So that gave us Milano cookies and Brussels cookies. And then she went to Switzerland, which gave us goldfish crackers, which, as I said, no family could exist without goldfish crackers. So that's a lesson. Personal family problem, but an opportunity to create something that didn't exist before, that doesn't come from government bureaucrats or planners, just people figuring out something, doing the experimentation, and creating that new knowledge. With that, let me say thank you very, very much, and I'll be around to eye what's been left on the table in terms of desserts, and thank you.